And so I teach at college. My name is Paige, and I teach at College of the Ozarks. And I teach primarily comp classes, which they have an ENG prefix, but not at all institutions. At some institutions, it's like a comp prefix. And I kind of wish it was that, because students come in and they think, oh, this is an English class, but really it's a writing class, right? And we all agree that writing is incredibly important across the disciplines. So at the college, Dean Bolger, over the past, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 years, developed what he named the FEP project, the Faithful Education Project. And it is an invitation, also an assignment, but an invitation for faculty to think about how their faith, their Christian faith and their Christian walk and their theology intersects with the discipline they teach. So, as I stepped back to think about whether or not faith and writing intersect and how they intersect, I actually pursued this on a very, very theoretical and theological level, and tried to meet that pragmatically and practically in the classroom. So I taught at Branson High School for 8 years before coming to College of the Ozarks. I'm really thankful for both my high school instruction days and my college instruction days, understanding that continuum and how students and people develop as writers. So something I started observing really carefully, but became very obvious to me when I started teaching at the college level among freshman students in the comp classroom, was that they lack an awareness of the reader. So many college students, and I think this is right of high school students probably as well, and I think it's true of students in general. I felt that students view writing as a form of self-expression or a means to an end. And what would the end be? The grade. So, and I begin a lot of my freshman comp classes that way by asking them what reading or what writing is for, who writing is for. A lot of them say themselves. A lot of them say the grade. A lot of them say the teacher, right? And there's this sort of familiar refrain of, I just want to know what you want. So I also, though, when I just considered this outside of my classroom, my immediate answer was yes. Faith and writing intersect. Like, I love language, and our God is a God who designed us with the capacity for language, which differentiates us from all other animals. Charles Taylor also wrote a book called The Language Animal, which is really great in its discussion of that capacity. And he is a God who chose to engage with us through language. In fact, his very incarnation is called the what? The Word, right? So I had this really fun philosophical exploration ahead of me, and I also had this really pressing question in my classroom, which is, why aren't students aware of the reader? And is that important? Okay, so why does that problem exist? Why does this problem of reader awareness exist? Because I have a habit of loving to hang out in theory, in the theory area of things. So I was happy to do this exploration about how my faith intersects with my love of writing and language. But could I find a practical application for it in my classroom? Did I believe it applied there? So these questions were kind of hanging out in the back of my head. Why does the problem exist among students of reader awareness? Does it matter? What do I believe about how faith and writing, faith and the teaching of writing intersect? And if they do, if faith intersects with the teaching of writing, does that intersection address the problem I was noticing? Okay, so that's kind of complex, but those were the complexities that were going on in my head when I launched out on this FEP. So first, I conducted an exploration of just that kind of theological element of who I believe God is and what language is then, as we are created in the image of God. So like I said, read some Charles Taylor, who says that language is not simply an instrument, rather it is constitutive of our ability to understand our own existence and to articulate and share our human experience. The linguistic capacity is essentially something that is shared, right? So again, when we think who is writing for, it usually, unless it's journal, is not just ourselves. And this is out of The Language Animal. And I came to some conclusions about the dialogical nature of language. That language is about dialogue, right? We can monologue, and that's important, but in the end, it's about dialogue. Through the use of symbol, we build ourselves landscapes of meaning, again, Charles Taylor, by which we orient ourselves in the world and establish footings for relationships and dialogues with others. So there is a lot of purpose in language. And kind of my exploration led me to this next step, which is that our God is the God of language. Acknowledging its power and function, then, how do we as Christians better understand God's purpose in giving us the gift of language, the ability to engage with Him and others? And so, again, I'm thinking about my students in the back of my head, and I'm thinking, I am very convinced of this. How do I convince my students of that? And then how does that come through in the tedium of analyzing sentence structure in a 5-paragraph essay, right? In how to put in transition words, and am I just going to get an A on this? Where can I make this matter? So my conclusions to this theological exploration, right, is that God's word is to us is revelatory. God's word meets us on common ground. That His language does not simply inform, but forms us, right? It creates relationship, it invites response, and it shapes us. And the theme that kept coming through here for me was purpose and dialogue. Andrew Moore says that as the fulfillment of God's covenantal promise, Christ incarnate is God's ultimate speech act. I love that. For word and action have always been one in the teleological enactment of God's promises. So again, had a lot of fun exploring just what I believe about who God is and what His picture and design of language is about. So the next question then was, how does this relate to the classroom? So this title slide is my second title slide. The first one went with my FEP. This one has been the expansion of my FEP in my attempt to challenge myself to not just let what I believe about God and language be a theory, but to let it be something that impacts my teaching, even in the tediousness of teaching, the dirty nitty-gritty of writing, okay, like dangling modifiers and whatnot. So this is kind of where I had to, after my FEP, I actually presented my FEP for the faculty, but then also at another conference, and at the end of it, you know what people asked me about all that theory? Do you know what they asked me? What's the practical application? And I was like, I don't want to do practical application. But what am I as a teacher if this is what I believe and I'm not letting it impact my teaching? So this exploration. So the new title is Writing for the Reader, the Role of Compassion in the Composition Classroom. That first title slide still has relevance, okay? I believe that the way we teach students to write should be in who they are as Christians. So it's kind of maybe become funny to my students now because we have this common mantra when I'm telling them to do something in their writing, because I say, who is writing for? And they all respond, the reader, yes! So it is a very common and familiar little refrain we do in my classroom, that writing is for your reader. And that if you are going to write well, you cannot write only in terms of self-expression. You are expressing yourself, but you had better be observing the Christian ethic by taking a posture towards your reader that is caring, because what do we want to communicate in writing? We want to communicate truth, ultimately, and we want to communicate it well. And when we share truth, if we don't do it with love, and we don't do it with compassion, and we don't do it in a way that takes care of the reader and ushers them carefully through ideas to form new realizations in their mind, then we're not really doing it with love, and we're not really doing it in the Christian ethic. Okay, so I had some observations about student writers, and I have some student writers in the classroom. So that's good. I'm glad you guys are here. But these were the observations. Many high school writers, and this is kind of a repeat of what I've said, and college freshmen, composition students lack an awareness of the reader. They view writing as monological. So that was a term that I really developed in my scholarship on this topic. A monological approach to writing, self-expression, a means to earn a grade, and they still do this. They'll be frustrated with the grade they got on the paper, and they say, I just want to know what you want. Yes?
Can I ask what monological means?
Okay, yes, you can. Monological, so dialogical means what? Dialogue is talking between multiple people, right? So monological builds off of monologue, right? So monological would mean only speaking to the self. It's only this self-expression. Okay, and I didn't have to develop that term, Will. I could have just said self-expression, but I wanted to develop this to create a contrast to what it's supposed to be, which is dialogical. But most students do not enter writing realizing that they're entering an entire dialogue of the history of ideas. In fact, they don't really feel often empowered to be able to do that. When I got my rejection notice, I was like, wow, I am preaching to kids that they can enter the dialogue of the history of ideas, and I'm not even sure if I can enter it. But I really do believe it. Okay, so in my thinking and my exploration, which is really what I'm inviting you all into, I was trying to figure out why this whole self-expression thing is an issue in student writers. Why are they not inherently aware of the person on the other end? And I encountered what I'm gonna call it the era of hyper-individualism. And this, I thought, was maybe just a term that I had made up, and it's not. It's out there. This is what people are calling it, hyper-individualism in the West. And so I think we could get into a deep conversation about hyper-individualism, but I think you probably get the gist of what I mean, that we live in the Western world, we live in a secularized society, and one of our American values that is very important is individualism, right? But there's a lot of ongoing sociological research right now that shows that we've kind of maybe gone too far in that direction. That now it's all about the self, the selfie, the self-importance, what is good for me, right? You do you, right, is kind of a familiar saying. So the problem of hyper-individualism has also influenced the way students approach writing. As individuals seek, Robert Jensen wrote a piece called, I think it's How the World Lost Its Story. It's on First Things, and it's in my bibliography, which I have some copies of if you want it. But as individuals seek narrative identity, which we all do inherently because we're humans, we want a bigger story to help understand who we are. In a culture devoid of common meaning, which is the pluralized West, they develop an inward focus solely on the self, right? What do I have to say? Because I've been taught that my voice matters, so what do I want to say? And if you don't like it, that's fine. This is just me expressing myself, right? And I kind of considered social media's role in this. I didn't do a whole lot of research on it. I've actually done more research since then by reading books like iGods and iGen, and I do not hate social media. I have social media accounts and I enjoy it. But some people argue that social media creates meaningful community. And I think social media can create community of forms. But my question was, in terms of language and dialogue, does social media create venues for actual constructive dialogue? Do we respond meaningfully to each other, or are we just competing to be the loudest? And that is not a question I've come to a conclusion on, but it was something in the back of my head. Again, while social media can offer platforms for emerging communities and for sharing life in meaningful ways, many young participants fail to engage with those communities. Or they're just putting, I was thinking of my niece who's now 17. She kind of went through a major selfie phase on Instagram. And what I noticed was she was gaining affirmation and worth from how many likes her posts would get. That is not engaging in meaningful dialogue. That's doing something entirely different. Another form of self-expression. And yes, she was getting feedback, but it wasn't an exchange of ideas, okay? So essentially, our culture leads us to forget the concept of dialogue. And if you remember back to my theological exploration, one of the main themes was dialogue, that's what God gave us language for. So suddenly, though, we find ourselves here forgetting the concept of healthy dialogue and what that looks like, the role of dialogue in forming ideas, right? That maybe when I arrive on the scene, what I believe isn't the end of the story. Maybe other people's ideas and perspectives can actually inform my understanding of truth. The role of dialogue in engaging others as human beings with dignity, and of valuing dialogue as a means of discovering truth. So, I love language. I believe that God gave us language for the purpose of engaging one another and Him. And our culture causes us to end up kind of here. And I really do believe this all plays out in a very real way in the classroom. So, another driving question as I was doing this exploration was, what then is the response of the Christian educator? How do we move students from monologue, which through no real fault of their own, our culture has pushed us all towards, right? How do we move students from monologue to dialogue and call them to a posture of care? And actually even get them to believe and imagine that there is someone on the other end of their writing who matters. So, the role of the composition course in all of this. My hope is that learning to write challenges each student to be conscious of the power of language, the necessity of dialogue, and the existence of the reader. And furthermore, that the student will eventually move beyond awareness of the reader and assume a posture of care towards others, the presumed reader, listener, and community. Okay, so that's kind of, if I think about what I could make happen and what would actually help my students be good writers, this would be a major crux of the issue. All right, so then, remember, I'm challenging myself to do practical application. I'm challenging myself to really think about how this should inform my pedagogy. So I had to think about how this informs instruction. So one thing I want my students to know is that they're called to contribute to urgent conversations of political and cultural concern. Not every writing assignment is going to do that. But right now, our high school students and my college students are watching the primaries, right? And figuring out what happens and looking at debates. The spring forum at SofO is on capitalism and socialism. And there's a whole lot of people spouting their beliefs about capitalism and socialism who aren't really informed, right? So I want my students to know that they're called to contribute to those conversations, but they're called to do it responsibly. That they're called to participate in relevant and often secularized conversations within chosen professions, and that they're called to study and participate with their own voices in the history of ideas. This quote is from Chris Kearns. So he is a dean. I forget the college that he's at. He's a dean and has been a vice president, and he's been a comp teacher, and he writes an article about the recursivity of writing. So I would say one really practical application. How many of you are teachers of writing, by the way? 3. You all are young writers. You teach writing? Okay, awesome. How many of you as writing teachers have watched students approach writing as a linear process? I sit down, I begin, I write through to the end, and I am done. Have we ever seen this? Okay. So he writes this awesome article, which I encourage all of you to write, about what it means for students to come to the realization that writing is recursive. And he has this quote that says, "The desire to be understood requires us to find ourselves in relation to the purposes and needs of the reader, who must serve as a partner in shaping our language," right? We mark, how many of you mark word choice on your students' papers, right? We mark word choice, but am I marking it in such a way that they have the conscious realization that the reason that matters is because it was weird for the reader? The reader didn't get exactly what you were saying because the word choice wasn't the most precise word. So, gentlemen, sorry, and young lady, I'm preaching to you here a little bit, but like that word choice, right? It's not personal because it's actually not about us as the writer. It's about the reader. And he continues and says, to shape our language, the essential feature of composition confronting all thoughtful undergraduates or high school students is that it establishes a real human relationship. So that's what I want to develop in my students, is a consciousness of the reader. Okay. It can form in them coherence in their essays, yada, yada. Okay, so driving questions then for application would be these. Who do young writers think writing is for? We've talked about that. Are they conscious of a reader as they write? I am interested in your feedback as writing teachers. Do you think students are conscious of a reader as they write?
Well, you're using reader a lot, and I'm wondering, are you only talking about written word that gets read by someone else and evaluated, or are you talking about a piece of writing that gets presented orally to a classroom full of people?
Both. So reader or listener.
I would hope that they'd be conscious of their listening audience when they're presenting it, because they have to.
It does force them to be more so, right?
And I would think it would depend on the type of writing it is. If it's persuasive, they want to know what their audience, what their slant might be, and if.
Although, have you ever heard a student present a piece of written work that clearly was not clear to the listeners?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Right.
So I'm going to present to you some ideas by Linda Flower, who I really, really like. She talks about writer-based prose versus reader-based prose. But I don't agree with everything she says. Part of what she says is that every assignment should be designed so the student has real readers that aren't just the teacher. I disagree with that. I think, I kind of side a little more with Donald Murray, who I'm also going to talk about, who says that if I'm really always going to be thinking about the reader, whether or not the public or the masses are going to have their hands on this, which for the most part they will not, it will be your teacher reading your assignment, right? Whether or not there's ever a real reader other than my teacher, I should be able almost to inhabit the consciousness of the critical reader. And that's really what I'm striving in the end for my students. And I think that's why I don't call it the audience. I call it the reader, because it's reader-based prose. It's knowing if there's a gap between the ideas in my sentences and how I could have just lost the reader. Or knowing after this reader reads this paragraph, what would be all of his or her questions down the margin? Have I left anything unanswered? Did that transitional word really help form the accurate relationship in the mind of my reader? So that is a good question. I mean, I don't know if audience would help with also having kids realize that, look, if you're getting up in front of your fellow students, you really have to be in their heads a little bit.
My eighth graders are writing judicial addresses where they don't call it an audience, they call it the judge. And the judge has to be somebody who they know to disagree with the point they're trying to make.
Yeah.
So they have a hostile audience from the get-go, and they have to think about the bias of the audience.
That's awesome. So, I mean, I think that is a great assignment that's already doing a lot of the work, right? But I know a lot of my students throughout my years in high school and college in my writing assignments, I cannot just come up with some other reader audience that isn't me, you know? But they need to be consistently writing. So I get to be it, but I want them to have created a hypothetical reader in their brains, okay? So does consciousness of the reader actually produce any change? That would be another really important question, namely clarity and cohesion in a student's writing. Does familiarity with meta-discourse help students to write more clearly? So Ken Hyland writes about meta-discourse, and in the world of comp, that's a term, so you may or may not have heard it, but essentially it breaks down into things like transitional words, hedging, qualifying statements. So it's basically things that a writer who has a well-developed voice can do to carry the reader through the ideas with him. right? Although I said this above, right, this idea takes precedence here because. So meta-discourse is the language we use in writing to help communicate the ideas in our writing. So I can remember being at the high school and teaching transitional words. I don't know if I ever once said the word "the reader." So I'm handing my students this tool of words like however and in conclusion, which we never want them to use, of course. And I think they know they're supposed to use it, and they have kind of a general concept of, oh, I'm connecting ideas, but I don't know if I ever even made it clear who it's for and why it's so important to do it precisely, because it's not your own brain that you're transitioning for. It's for the brain of the reader, right? So, do students see multiple drafts as important? So that recursivity. Is there any value in coming back to my writing? For a long time, I completely abandoned peer review sessions in the classroom. Have any of you writing teachers ever been frustrated with peer review sessions in the classroom?
Yes.
What was that frustration about?
Because they, unless I partnered them with someone, they got with their friend in the process, checked it off, and then talked about what they were going to gain.
Fortnite, right.
Right.
Yeah. Sorry, guys. So, do you also play Fortnite? Okay. Yes.
My frustration was oftentimes the idea that I think they feared the feedback they'd get on their own paper. And so their feedback to others is, you did a great job.
Right.
And I was just telling my students, don't hate your friend that much because you know it's not good.
That's right. And so what I've started doing is, so I have I don't know, some people would not see this as a blessing, they'd see it as a curse, but I get to be in a computer lab and I love it when I teach my writing classes. So we do a lot of workshopping time in there. But something I have them do a lot and get in the habit of doing is they trade spots at the actual computer. And somehow when they get in front of that screen, they do not talk to each other as much. They're zoned in on the screen and they've got a keyboard. So they engage with that. So they get in that zone, and I ask them to use Microsoft Word track changes in the comment feature, and they have to ask every single question that pops in their head as they're reading. Now, the other side of this is, for students to be able to do that, what do they have to be good at? They have to be good at reading and asking active questions as a text. That's where I think you all are at a distinct advantage at classical Christian education schools, because your students have grown up, K through 12, doing a lot of reading. And I know you start annotating very early. The students I get at the college who come out of public school do not necessarily actively read. I think the chances, though, at a classical Christian education school are higher for doing that kind of active reading. So, does reading a paper aloud to oneself or with someone else make students more aware of a reader? So I have my students engage in that practice more. I also read kind of a research publication about some co-teachers in a classroom who they would use recording devices and get on the computer and read the students writing out loud. Or they would have peers do this, read it out loud into a mic, and every time they hit a spot, they would actually stumble over it, or they would pause mid-reading and ask the questions out loud. And then the student would listen to that in the computer lab and have to deal with the reader's questions. So part of the development of reader awareness is helping students develop a reader's mind, right? How is someone going to read this if they're not me? Okay, and then do reader response sessions in the Writing Center make students more aware of a reader? I know over at the college we have the Writing Center, and I get the luxury of requiring those appointments at times on certain assignments, and they have to, I think they have to, I should actually know this. One of them reads the paper out loud. I actually prefer, and I encourage my students to have it be the writing assistant who reads it out loud. Why? So they can hear their own writing, and what inevitably happens if there's problems in the writing? There's a lot of stumbling, right? And I have students who, and I think I do this as a writer, they don't see the problems in their own sentence structure until they hear it. And they're like, oh, that sounds weird. okay? And that's a good point of realization.
I find also that the logic and reasoning that they have in their head while they're writing the paper doesn't always transfer into words that explain that well. So
Absolutely.
listening to their own written word read out loud for the first time and just sit there and listen to it allows them to hear, I think for the first time, exactly what they wrote on the paper, and then I think they can better discern if they've truly expressed themselves well or explained themselves well.
Right.
It's a great practice.
Yeah. When a lot of times when towards the beginning of the semester, when I just kind of try and get my kids talking about how they feel about writing, because a lot of them do not have good feelings about writing. And one of the main struggles they voice is that they have good ideas, but how to get those ideas from their head to the page in a successful way. And the key element that changes everything in that process is being in the mind of the reader. At least I'm convinced of that. All right, so writer-based prose versus reader-based prose is the language I use. It comes from Linda Flower. Again, I don't agree with all of her ideas for assignments. I think a student should be able to read an assignment that only the teacher's ever going to see and be just as conscious of a reader. I think they have to be. But one of the papers, sorry, there should be a quotation on the other end of that, I have copies of if you want to take, is called Writer-based Prose, a cognitive basis for problems in writing. So I have named these things as problems. But right now, I am teaching essays in my comp classes. And my students are so concerned about things like dead words. I know you're familiar with those. Like dead words and doing something wrong that they can hardly start writing. Okay? And I understand that because the finished product does need to turn out a certain way. It needs to be ideal for the reader. But in this article, Linda Flower, even though she's writing an article that says we've got to move them to reader-based prose, she spends a lot of time talking about the value of writer-based prose. So writer-based prose serves an important function. So I've tried to tell my kids, stop worrying about what's going to happen and just start writing. Sometimes you are going to have 12 sentences in there that you're going to pull out later, but you had to write those 12 sentences to get to what you eventually wanted to say. It's kind of called writing your way to a thesis, right? So writer-based prose serves an important function. Namely, we write to learn. We know this. That's a phrase that Donald Murray has coined. We write to learn. I learned as I was writing my Dillard paper. I learned as I was writing my FEP, not just doing the research, but actually typing out the words. New realizations were forming in me. So we write to learn, to confront our own ideas, to interact with our subject matter. Okay, so that's a valuable and important step. We don't want to negate that, but this is why it's recursive. We cannot stop at writer-based prose. Okay, that's like pre-writing. So the reader in writer-based prose, these are the things, some of the things she identifies. The reader is forced to do most of the thinking. The reader has to draw the conclusions. The reader has to organize the concepts because the writer didn't do that work for them. I tell my writing students over and over, your reader should have to do absolutely no work. And sometimes they think I mean dumb it down, and that is not true. So C.S. Lewis, one of my favorite authors, when I read him, man, many, many occasions I've read a chapter, a few pages, and I think he has just articulated the most complex truth that has been whispering to me from my soul my entire life, but I never could articulate it. And he just articulated it in a way that was so accessible. And that's what I try to communicate to my students about good writers. They do not dumb an idea down. They say it so well that it's accessible to almost everyone. So, the reader shouldn't have to do any work. Another problem with writer-based prose is that it's often in a narrative framework, okay, instead of analytical. Now, sometimes as writers, we need to kind of tell the story that got us there before we jump into the analysis of ideas. But that is an identifier of writer-based prose. The prose features the writer's discovery process, again, very valuable, not what we need in the end product, and it often lacks structure, transition, meta-discourse, and explicit claims. A lot of beating around the bush, but what are you really saying, okay? And the other The other writer who I really like on this subject matter is Donald Murray. I have copies of both Flower and Murray, as well as my FEP. Teaching the Other Self. So he actually identifies where Linda Flower says you have to create assignments by which students will have real readers other than the teacher. Murray says what I actually believe, which is that that reader is inside the writer's mind. So I'm actually going to read to you this little excerpt from his from this article. He says, "The act of writing might be described as a conversation between two workmen, muttering to each other at the workbench. The self speaks, the other self listens and responds. The self, the writer, proposes, and the other self, the reader, considers. The self, the writer, makes, and the other self, the reader, evaluates. The two selves collaborate. A problem is spotted, discussed, defined. Solutions are proposed, rejected, suggested, attempted, tested, discarded, and eventually accepted." And another way he explains this as maybe an artist, when you zoom in and you're painting that particular part and then you step back to look at the whole thing, right? And he says, "The term monitor is significant for the reading during writing involves awareness on many levels and includes the opportunity for change." He says, the writer, as the text evolves, the writer's other self has to read fragments of language as well as completed units of language. What isn't on the page as well as what is on the page. What should be left out as well as what needs to be put in. Even patterns and designs, sketches of possible relationships between pieces of information, fragments of rhetoric or language that we do not usually consider language are read and discussed by both the self and the other self, the writer and that conscious reader in the background. So, I tell my students a lot that writing is really hard. It is one of the hardest cognitive functions that we're capable of as humans. I've read that somewhere, and I believe it, so I say it. Don't ask me to cite the information. But the bottom line is, you have to be the creator and your biggest critic at the same time. You have to be in the mind of the person producing and expressing and in the mind of the person absorbing, and you have to find all of the gaps and disconnects. Okay, so I've given you just a very few ways that I practically play this out. So I have them read out loud to each other. I get frustrated with that too, though. It gets noisy in the room. So one of the best things is that I have them look at each other's writing, but all they're allowed to write is questions. Because that's all a real reader can do, is ask questions. So we talk about what questions are good. Questions about the relationships between ideas, about the connections between sentences, about exact word choice, about the choice of sentence structure, about why a comma here or not. Because as the reader, that confused me. Another thing that I want to try but haven't yet is like the podcasting, like the reading aloud of their work, so that they have to listen to somebody read it aloud. I do require writing center sessions. The other thing that I have found to be really, really, really helpful is conferences with students where I only ask questions. Where I play that role of the critical reader. And in my grading, I have started to ask a lot of questions in the margin. And I think we do that naturally as writing teachers anyways. So that wasn't a hard adjustment. What I would challenge you to do, all right, can I challenge you guys to do something in the next 15 minutes? Is that allowed? It was called a workshop. I didn't mean to talk this long.
I think I got out of the way. I'm going to have to leave. But yeah.
Okay. So what I might challenge you to do then, maybe the teachers get in a group and think about an assignment that you actually teach, because this is not an overhaul to teaching. This doesn't involve throwing your curriculum out the window. This is what little mini lessons can I embed in my writing assignments that I have already, where the language I use focuses on developing a consciousness of the reader in my student's mind. on developing what Donald Murray actually calls the critical reader in the mind of the student. So that's what I would challenge you to do in the next 15 minutes, is maybe get in groups and talk about either how you've done this and seen it work, or how you could imagine taking peer review moments, or a lesson on transitions, and how can you work consciousness of the reader into that. Okay. And students, why don't you get together and think about what areas of your writing you are most unaware of the reader. Where do you really struggle to take care of the reader and to remember him or her? Okay? Go for the next 10 minutes.